So we're very happy to bring to you the discussion today. And we want to thank Larry Danos, who suggested the speaker and the topic. So we're very appreciative of that. So thank you, Larry, for doing that. So the speaker today is Peter Drekmeier. Peter's position is Policy Director for the Tuolumne River Trust. And he's been very active in a variety of activities, and I'll just let him tell you more about that. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Peter.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Jim. Really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Larry, for inviting me. And Jim, you've done a fabulous job pulling this together. It sounds like we have a well-educated group. And what I'd like to do is welcome questions as we go along. You don't need to wait till the end. I always like working with Unitarians, my kind of people. So thank you for this opportunity. Again, I'm Peter Drekmeier. I'm the Policy Director for the Tuolumne River Trust. And I've been working for the Trust since 2007, so about 13 years. And I'll present a lot of information about our water system. You don't need to remember it all, no quiz at the end. But maybe you'll walk away with just a general better understanding of where our water comes from and some of the challenges ahead, especially to the ecosystem that we are stewards of. So I have some slides, and I'm going to bring those up now. Can everybody see okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. Okay. So this is a map of the Tuolumne. You see that it starts in Yosemite National Park. It drains the northern half. The Merced River drains the southern half, and it's the Merced that carves out Yosemite Valley. And you see Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, our water source, there in Yosemite. And then the river flows west. There's a much larger reservoir called Don Pedro. It's about 6 times as big as Hetch Hetchy. And that's owned and operated by the Modesto and Turlock irrigation districts. And it's primarily for irrigation water for crops. About 200,000 acres are irrigated with Tuolumne water. And then the Tuolumne flows through Modesto. It joins with the San Joaquin River, and that flows up into the Delta and the Bay, and some water even makes it out the Golden Gate into the Pacific Ocean. So that's the journey of the Tuolumne. And most of the Tuolumne's water starts as snow in the Sierra. And as snow melts and as rain comes down, lots of little streams form and start joining together to becoming bigger waterways. And just upstream of Tuolumne Meadows is where the name Tuolumne starts. And kind of hard for some people to pronounce it. So what we teach the kids is to say Tuolumne, Tuola you. And so that's a nice way to remember our river's name. And then from Tuolumne Meadows, the river flows through the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne, which is a fabulous area to hike, lots of waterfalls. There's some cabins there called Glen Allen, just a beautiful area. And what you see is a lot of granite, which Yosemite's famous for. And granite is very hard. It doesn't erode very quickly, which is why we have such beautiful vistas and waterfalls. But the water is also really clean. There's not much sediment in it. And as a result, Hetch Hetchy water doesn't have to be filtered. It gets treated with chloramine when it gets to the Bay Area to disinfect anything that might be in it. But it's an incredibly wonderful water supply. And this is the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. The dam has a different name. It's called O'Shaughnessy Dam. And I'll get to that in a minute, but we haven't always had the Hetch Hetchy water source. So originally, when Westerners started to settle San Francisco, all of the water on site, it was from creeks and a few little lakes and groundwater. And with the gold rush and people from all over the world moving to California and San Francisco, the city grew quite a bit and had a real problem meeting the water needs, especially in drier years. So Spring Valley Water Company, a private company, developed Crystal Springs Reservoir on the peninsula. and that water was available to San Francisco from San Mateo Creek. And there are other reservoirs in the Bay Area. The largest one is Calaveras, which straddles Alameda and Santa Clara counties. But soon those Bay Area supplies weren't enough as San Francisco continued to grow. So the city was looking for a much larger, reliable water supply. And they identified Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. And this is what the valley looked like at the time. And you can see the Tuolumne River flowing through it. And they put this fellow, Michael O'Shaughnessy from Department of Public Works, in charge of developing the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. And so the dam is named after him, O'Shaughnessy Dam. But there was a lot of opposition to building a dam and infrastructure in a national park led by John Muir and the Sierra Club. And they went to Congress and said, you can't allow a city to build a dam in a national park. It belongs to the people of the United States. It's a place where wildlife thrives. And Congress agreed that it wasn't an appropriate location. But in 1906, there was the great earthquake and the fires that ensued, and a lot of San Francisco burned down. So San Francisco went back to Congress and said, that we can't allow this to happen again. We need a reliable water supply. And in 1913, Congress granted permission for San Francisco to build the dam. There was an act passed called the Raker Act. And the dam was completed in 1923. And this is what the dam looks like. Again, that's O'Shaughnessy Dam. And it turned Hetch Hetchy Valley into Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. And you might remember seeing those two waterfalls in the background that were in the original photo. And they're still there. You can actually drive to Hetch Hetchy. It's a lot less crowded than the valley or Tuolumne Meadows, but it's a beautiful area. And there's a trail you can walk across the dam, and then there's a trail that heads over to that first waterfall, and then the trail up into the back country. So it's a lovely area. So Hetch Hetchy doesn't provide water just to San Francisco, but also to customers in San Mateo County, the northern part of Santa Clara County, and the southern part of Alameda County. So about a third of the water comes to San Francisco and 2/3 to the outer areas. So 2.7 million people altogether get all or most of their water from the Sfpc. And of that water, 85% comes from Hetch Hetchy, 15% from the Bay Area. The 26 agencies outside of San Francisco, like where I live, Palo Alto, are represented by an organization called BOSCA, which is the Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency. And they negotiate with San Francisco and keep San Francisco in line on certain occasions. So occasionally you'll hear me refer to BOSCA. Again, the Hetch Hetchy water is so clean and high value that when Willie Brown was mayor of San Francisco, he toyed with the idea of bottling it and selling it to tourists at the San Francisco airport. But the Raker Act prohibits this kind of profit making from the water. So this project didn't go very far, but there are a few collector's items, bottles of Hetch Hetchy still out there. We share the river with a lot of other creatures. One of my favorites is rainbow trout. And rainbow trout are really fascinating. They're born in fresh water, and they can live their whole life there. They can reproduce and stay rainbow trout. But if they have access to the ocean, some of them will migrate out and become a saltwater fish, which is called a steelhead. And they'll live in the ocean for 2.5 years or so. And then when it's time for them to spawn, they have to come back to the fresh water, and they come back to the same river where they were born if they have access to it, and we'll start the process over. So below Hetch Hetchy, we do not have steelhead because remember there's a much larger dam, Don Pedro, downstream. But downstream of Don Pedro, we still have some steelhead. And this is what a steelhead looks like. So there's a lot more food in the ocean, and the fish can get much larger, the steelhead. And then they bring all those nutrients into the upland habitat where they provide food for a lot of other animals. Some of those nutrients fertilize the soil. So they perform a really amazing service in bringing these nutrients to areas that need them. And there are a lot of creatures that feed on rainbow trout and steelhead and other fish. This is one of my favorites, the river otter, very playful animal. The Tuolumne is also a world-class whitewater rafting and kayaking destination. It's class 4, which is advanced, and you need a good guide. There's one class 5 rapid, which is Clavey Falls right here. And it's just a beautiful protected area. You don't see traffic, occasionally maybe a plane flying overhead, but it's a really wonderful nature experience. And we usually do 2-day trips. So there's camping on the beaches along the bank, and wonderful stars at night, sometimes shooting stars. So if you ever have a chance to get out on the Tuolumne, it's really a wonderful adventure and a beautiful experience. There are little side canyons with creeks and small rivers, great for swimming, for fly fishing, wonderful waterfalls. And our organization was founded in 1981 at a time when more dams were proposed for that section of the Tuolumne. And we organized and we convinced Congress in 1984 to designate the Upper Tuolumne River as a wild and scenic river, which means dams cannot be built and no development along the banks. Some of you might remember Richard Chamberlain at the far left of the table. He was the star from the Thornbirds. And the crew took him down the river and he fell in love with it. And every time he had an interview on Good Morning America or other national news services, he'd always mention the Tuolumne, and it became a national issue. So again, in 1984, the upper 83 miles of the Tuolumne, from the headwaters in Yosemite all the way down to Don Pedro Reservoir, were designated a wild and scenic river. And here is a map of the watershed. You can see Don Pedro roughly in the middle, and everything upstream is the wild and scenic stretch. This is Don Pedro Dam. It's the 6th largest reservoir in the state. The dam is almost 600 feet tall, so you can see why fish couldn't get back and forth over that dam. There's also a smaller, older dam a couple miles downstream called LaGrange, which was built in 1893. And that cut off 85% of the spawning habitat for creatures that come up from the ocean to spawn. And those 2 dams are currently going through relicensing. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission oversees dams that generate hydropower. And Don Pedro Dam received its original license back in 1966. It was a 50-year license. So the new license was supposed to be issued by 2016. And it's been an opportunity for us to weigh in and say, you know, the river's not in very good shape. You need to impose requirements to improve conditions for salmon and other species. At the time, the irrigation district said, well, Don Pedro Dam doesn't block the fish. It's our other dam downstream, LaGrange, that does, and it's never required a license. But at that point, FERC required LaGrange to get a license. So we've been in that process now for over 10 years. So this is the lower Tuolumne, below those dams. And you can see it's very gentle. It's a different river than the Whitewater up top. But it's very beautiful. We do a lot of kayaking trips there and canoeing, especially in November, which is salmon spawning season. And we get to see the salmon as they're coming up to spawn. And these are the salmon. They're fall run Chinook salmon. We used to have spring run that would come up in the spring, but because of the dams, they don't spawn in the Tuolumne anymore. But these fall run will come up as far as LaGrange Dam, and they'll lay their eggs in the gravel, and the next generation is on its way. They're also called king salmon because they're the largest. This salmon was found in Battle Creek, which is in California, but it wasn't on the Tuolumne. It weighed 108 pounds. So that's a lot of nutrients it brought up from the ocean to fuel the food web. And the life cycle is that they start off in fresh water. The eggs are laid around November, and in the spring, the fish are getting bigger, and when they're about 6 inches, maybe April or May, and there's good runoff, that's when they'll outmigrate to the ocean. The fish that are coming up to spawn, they actually stop eating, and they'll come up. The female will lay about 5,000 eggs, and the male will fertilize them, and then they die. And those nutrients from their body become part of the food web. Most of the eggs get eaten by other creatures, most of the baby fish get eaten, and most of the adult fish get eaten, including by us. So again, it's not just about salmon, but it's about a salmon-based ecosystem. So much depends on the salmon. So a few things that we do in the lower Tuolumne, we've been working for many years on the Tuolumne River Parkway. So a series of parks along the river to give people access and to provide habitat for wildlife. We have a program called Trekking the Tuolumne, where we take classrooms out and treat the river like a living laboratory, teach them about bugs and fish and other creatures and water quality, and hope that they'll develop a lifelong love and appreciation for their river. We have an adventure club that takes youth out, teaches them river skills like boating, fishing, and again, hoping that they learn to really appreciate the river running through their community. Engaging people of all ages in water quality monitoring. A lot of that information is used by resource agencies. This is an inspiring story. This fellow, Guptill, who grew up in Modesto and teaches middle school now, he started getting out on the river kayaking, and it was a wonderful experience, but there were sections of the river that were just littered with garbage. And he started organizing river cleanups every month. Been doing this for 8 years. It's called Operation 9 to 99. They're cleaning up from the 9th Street Bridge to Highway 99 in Modesto. And you can see they've had tremendous success, almost 4,000 volunteers, 525 tons of garbage, lots and lots of shopping carts and tires removed and hypodermic needles. This is a before shot and an after shot. So you can really make a difference. People love that experience. Another project we just completed a couple years ago was removing a small dam called Dennett Dam, which was built to create a swimming hole along the river. And it, after 1 year, it washed out. When there were big flows, they rebuilt it, it washed out again. So it's just been this decrepit remains for many, many years. And a couple of kids died there about 10 years ago. There's a hydraulic you can see on the right where the water does spill over, and they get sucked into that and they drown. And you can see the water hyacinth, which is a non-native, just collected behind that. There's an old boat there, and created a lot of problems for the salmon and steelhead that are coming up to spawn. So it took quite a while to get the permits and raise the money, but in 2018, the remainder of that dam was removed, and we celebrated by taking the mayor and some other muckety mucks down the river. That was the first time in many decades since the 1940s that stretch of river was boatable. So that was a nice victory. And this is where the Tuolumne meets with the San Joaquin River. The area to the left there is called Dos Rios. It was farmland, 1,600 acres for more than a century. And in 2012, we purchased it for $22 million and it's now being restored to wildlife habitat. One of the inspiring creatures is the riparian brush rabbit in the upper right here, which is an extremely endangered species. And with wildlife cameras, we've been able to identify that they've come back to Dos Rios. And the water table is very high there, so the native plants that are being planted grow really quickly. And it's an inspiration. It's something that people from around the state and even across the country have pointed to as bringing back nature, a very successful project. So the big challenge for the Tuolumne is that humans divert 21% of the river. So 4 out of 5 gallons comes to people, and we leave 1 out of 5 for every other species. And like in the rest of California, the amount of water diverted goes mainly to agriculture. So 80% of the diverted water is used for agriculture, 20% for urban areas, mostly in the Bay Area. And it's really a crime that the agricultural acreage just keeps expanding. And there's been a conversion over to nuts, which are very water intensive. And to produce 1 almond takes a gallon of water. A problem with this is that we're shifting from seasonal crops that can be fallowed if we have an extended drought to these permanent crops that need water every year. And so we're really hardening our ability to respond to droughts. And you can see during the recent drought, the amount of acreage just kept growing, while in urban areas, we were asked to reduce our water use by 25%. So this is a real problem. And in California, water is a public trust resource, meaning that it belongs to the people of California. There are water agencies that have water rights. They're allowed to use the water for beneficial uses. And you could argue that growing cheaper food is a beneficial use to Californians who buy that food. But with 26% of crops being exported overseas, what we're seeing is mostly corporate farms that are taking advantage of this public trust resource for personal gain. And that's something that we really need to look at, especially with climate change and water insecurity. Is this a good use of our limited water supplies? I would argue it's not. Another problem is that a lot of groundwater is pumped, and that can cause subsidence, where the earth actually settles down. And then we lose that groundwater capacity that we're going to need in the future. It also has a lot of impacts on infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals. So it can be very costly. And you can see in the photo on the left there, where the level of the surface was in 1925 and then 1977, just about a 30-foot drop in the level of the land. That's a problem. So back to the Tuolumne, the salmon population on the Tuolumne is the worst of California's Central Valley rivers. The state has a salmon doubling goal. So they looked at the populations from 1967 to 1991, averaged that out, and created a new goal. And for the Tuolumne, it's 38,000 salmon per year on average. But instead of making progress towards that number, we've lost ground. And this year we only had 1,000 salmon. So the situation's really bad. Those other 2 rivers in the red box are the Stanislaus River and the Merced, which are also in the San Joaquin. So the San Joaquin Valley rivers are much worse off than the Sacramento Valley rivers because so much water is being diverted. And there's a correlation between the flows and the health of the salmon population. So if there's a big water year and a lot of water is flowing down the river, then the baby fish have a better chance of surviving the journey to the ocean. The water's moving faster, it's murkier, they're less likely to get eaten by bigger fish. Many of those are invasive non-native fish like bass. So what this shows is that it actually shifts the flows by 2.5 years to match up the the population of adults that comes back, that's called escapement, in 2.5 years later. And what you find is in good water years, 2.5 years later, you have a higher population of salmon. So this shows that that water and flows are the key ingredient. So the San Joaquin River flows up into the delta, and delta is connected to the bay, which is connected to the Pacific Ocean. So that's the full journey of the river. And right now, everyone acknowledges that the Bay Delta ecosystem is in crisis. For decades, it's been in decline. The argument is over what we do about it. And scientists and environmental groups and fishing groups will all point to the best available science that says there's just not enough fresh water flowing into the delta and the bay. So the state has embarked on updating the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. So this was required by the Clean Water Act. It was first adopted in 1978. It was updated in 1995, but there haven't been any changes for 25 years. So this is a rare opportunity to improve conditions. So the delta is the largest estuary where freshwater and saltwater blend on the west coast of the Americas. And half of the water that falls on California drains out through the delta from the Sacramento River to the north and the San Joaquin River to the south. So it's a really important ecosystem, provides habitat for 500 species of fish and wildlife. It's a stopover for the Pacific Flyway. And it's the migration corridor for what we call anadromous fish that spend part of their life in freshwater and part in saltwater. So salmon and steelhead and sturgeon depend on that for rearing of transitioning from a freshwater fish to a saltwater fish and then coming back to the freshwater to spawn. Things changed a lot with the gold rush and the western settlement of California. The early agriculture was in the delta, and levees had to be built to protect that farmland. So land that had been floodplain, which is really important habitat, has been converted for human uses. And then upstream, there are a lot of water diversions. So there's a lot less fresh water flowing through the delta. And the flows are really important. They have a lot to do with water quality, including temperature. Our fish have evolved to live in cold water, fast-moving rivers. And this is a photo from the Klamath River in Northern California in 2002, when a lot of water got diverted during spawning season. And the water got too warm and 70,000 salmon died before they could spawn. So this is what can go wrong. Obviously, fish need water in order to get to their spawning grounds, and then even more importantly, to flesh out the babies. And the floodplains, as I mentioned, are really important because they provide really key habitat for the baby fish. It's a place where there's a lot more food for them, but also refuge from the large predator fish like bass that inhabit the main channel. So if you have good floodplains, you're much more likely to have these baby fish make it out to the ocean and eventually become adults. As I mentioned, we've altered the ecosystem from a fast-moving cold river to a slow-moving warm stream. And that favors non-native species that have evolved in those conditions. So this is water hyacinth from South America. We had mile upon mile of this invasive plant during the recent drought. It can double its biomass in 2 weeks. So obviously it has a huge impact on recreation, but also on salmon and other migratory fish that are coming up the river to spawn. And underneath that, you would have bass, which were introduced into the delta ecosystem, and they will prey on the baby salmon. So the water agencies will point to non-native species as a problem, and indeed they are a big part of the problem, but they're also more of a symptom of the problem that we've changed the ecosystem and the river needs more water. When you have higher water years, the invasive plants are not a problem and the populations of the bass decline. So the problem extends all the way down into the delta. You've probably heard about the toxic algae blooms. This is actually a cyanobacteria that can produce neurotoxins that will make pets and wildlife sick or kill them, and can make people sick. So again, it's the conditions. This warm, slow-moving water is conducive to the cyanobacteria. And it affects the salt balance of the delta and the bay. In an average year, about half of the fresh water doesn't make it to the bay anymore. Some years it's only a third of the fresh water makes it there. So salt water is intruding up into the delta. Some of that water even makes it to the delta pumps and ends up on farmland or in municipal water supplies. And so this change affects everything from the base of the food web, which is plankton, all the way up to large creatures like orcas out in the Pacific. You can see that a lot of different species have been in decline. There are 6 fish species in the delta that are either threatened or endangered, and some are getting very close to the brink of extinction, including the delta smelt, which was once an incredibly common fish. It's just a small little thing. This last year, they didn't find any in the wild. So very, very big problem. And again, it affects the whole food web all the way up to large charismatic creatures in the Pacific. It also affects people who depend on the salmon fishery for jobs. We still have a commercial salmon fishing industry out of Fisherman's Wharf over in Half Moon Bay. But that's been in decline. There used to be 10,000 fishing permits. Now we only have about 2,000. And in 2008 and 2009, the salmon population was so low that the commercial season had to be canceled. So that 2,200 people were out of jobs those years, and it was about a $250 million hit to the economy. So the Bay Delta Plan. It was divided into phases, and the first phase is looking at the San Joaquin River Basin, which is the heavily impacted basin. And they looked at the 3 main tributaries to the San Joaquin, the Tuolumne, the Merced, and the Stanislaus. And after many years, at the end of 2018, the State Water Board did vote, and it was a good vote. And essentially, they are requiring that 40% of the unimpaired flow, so that's the water that would be flowing down the rivers if there weren't dams and diversions, 40% would be required between February and June, those critical months for the baby fish. And again, on the Tuolumne, it's currently only 21%. So that would double those flows and have a really big impact. So they adopted this new flow regime, but it hasn't been implemented yet. And essentially there are lawsuits and other obstacles that have prevented it from actually creating new flows in these rivers. A really good thing about the plan is they're trying to incentivize things like habitat restoration and predator suppression to work along with the flows. So the idea is we need higher flows and we need these non-flow measures, and together we'll see results. So the flow range could be anywhere from 30 to 50%. If we're meeting biological and environmental goals with less water, the flows could go down to 30%, but if we're not meeting those goals, it could go up to 50%. So immediately after this vote was made, the irrigation districts in the Central Valley sued the State Water Board, which we expected. That's Trump country. They don't like government interference. They have a way of life that depends on diverting a whole lot of water. But we were very disappointed that San Francisco joined in that lawsuit. So here's one of the most liberal cities in the world with really high environmental standards suing the state over a plan that's so desperately needed. And a lot of our work has been trying to convince San Francisco to join us in supporting the plan and making the improvements that are necessary. So an interesting thing is San Francisco has junior water rights to the irrigation districts. So the irrigation districts push them around a little bit. And there was a contract signed in 1995 where San Francisco essentially agreed to follow the irrigation district's lead on fish flows. And that might be a reason why they are opposing the Bay Delta plan, because on paper, they have to follow their lead. So San Francisco has given up its ability to think independently and to do the right thing and to follow the will of its residents. And that's been a problem. Shortly after the environmental document for the Bay Delta plan came out, the general managers of the Sfpc and Bosca in the wholesale area had an editorial published in the Chronicle, and they said that the Bay Delta plan could cost 188,000 jobs and $49 billion. Well, we had been looking into their economic study, and we found a number of major flaws in advance of this. So we were very well prepared, and we actually gave a presentation to the State Water Board that convinced them that the sky is falling is not the reality of the situation. But also real world experience has shown us that their projections were way, way off. For example, between 2006 and 2016, we reduced our demand from Hetch Hetchy by 30%. And you can see that we've really done a good job. In 2016 and 17, we used less water than we did in 1977, despite population growth. And water demand hasn't rebounded to where it was pre-drought because a lot of things have changed, which I'll mention. But there's a lot to be proud of in this graph, but 30% reduction in water demand. And what the San Francisco study said, well, with 30% reduction, we'd lose 24,000, 25,000 jobs and $6.5 billion. But what happened during the drought is we added a lot of jobs. Jobs grew by 27%, which is a huge amount in that time period. But at the same time, our water demand dropped by 23%. So that's not per capita, it's total water demand. So the exact opposite of what San Francisco had projected. And our water demand is staying quite low. So interesting thing, you might have heard back in 2008, the SFPUC embarked on something called the Water System Improvement Program. So this is $4.8 billion in seismic upgrades to the Hetch Hetchy system, including pipes and dams in the Bay Area. So a huge project, 80 capital improvement projects, $4.8 billion. And at the time, they had projected that water demand in 2018 would be 285 million gallons per day for their customers in the Bay Area. But we negotiated with them a sales cap of 265. So basically they said, if you don't sue us and let these projects go forward, which we wanted to happen, we will not sell more than 265 million gallons per day. And we'll make up any deficit through water conservation and alternative water supplies like recycled water. So we all agreed to that, and the program went forward. Recently was completed, but we still have a lot of the debt service to pay off. But in 2013, before the drought even kicked in, we were down to 223 million gallons per day. And then we got to those two really low years, 175, 180. And the actual demand in 2018 was 196. So their projections were off by 31%. And this has happened throughout the state. Demand projections are always inflated, and a number of things have happened that encourage people to use water more efficiently. So one thing for us is the price of water has tripled since the Water System Improvement Program was implemented or was started. And again, this is to pay off $4.8 billion more when you include the debt service. And this is called price elasticity. As the price goes up, there's a price signal to customers, and demand goes down. So they might feel like, okay, now is the time to convert my thirsty lawn to drought tolerant landscaping, or take advantage of rebates to swap out my old toilet that used 5 gallons per flush to one that uses 1.5, or my washing machine. So a lot of these things have been happening, and that's probably the main reason why water demand has gone down. The other main reason is the drought, and people were told you need to reduce your water use. But interestingly, San Francisco has a 10-year financial plan for the Hetch Hetchy system, and their projection is that sales are going to remain flat for the next 10 years at least, and probably continue after that. So this is probably the most realistic demand projection we have. But the SFPUC, they have 3 sets of books. They'll use different numbers depending on what they want the outcome to be. So in trying to foment opposition to the Bay Delta plan, they use really high numbers, like 265 million gallons per day, not just as a future demand projection, but in some cases they say that's current demand, but current demand is 25% less than that. So a lot of what we have to do is explain to policymakers how the Hetch Hetchy system works, because once you realize how it works, you realize San Francisco is playing with the numbers. They're trying to use scare tactics to create opposition. So the way the water rights work is that the irrigation districts have senior water rights. So the first 2,400 cubic feet per second coming down the river belong to them. So a cubic foot is essentially a basketball of water. So the first 2,400 belong to them. And then there's a couple months between mid-April, mid-June, where that goes up to 4,000. So you can see a little bump here in the perforated line. And everything below that in the gray belongs to the irrigation districts. In the green, above that, belongs to San Francisco. And in dry years, San Francisco's water rights are very poor. You see 2012 to 2015, they didn't get a whole lot of water. But in an average year or a wet year, they have really good water rights. And so they can fill up their reservoirs, even if we've just been through a drought. So in an average year, the San Francisco PUC is entitled to 3 times as much water from the Tuolumne as demand. And so they've invested a lot in storage and reservoirs. Hetch Hetchy is only a quarter of the storage. So on the Tuolumne, there are 3 dams total that belong to the SFPUC. Then there's the water bank at Don Pedro. So San Francisco helped pay for Don Pedro Reservoir. In exchange, they got something called a water bank, where they can prepay water, which means if their reservoirs are full and they're entitled to more water, on paper, they can start accumulating water in this water bank. They can never access that water. But then if you have a series of dry years, they can take water at Hetch Hetchy that otherwise wouldn't be entitled to them and subtract an equal amount from the water bank. So it's a really good system. And then of course there are reservoirs in the Bay Area. So their total storage is almost 1.5 million acre feet, 1.5 million acre feet. And an acre foot is 1 acre a foot deep in water. So imagine a football field with a foot of water. That's an acre foot. So this is what happened during the drought. You can see the water bank got lower, but they can manage it in a way that they can keep Hetch Hetchy close to full. And so we're not threatened with running out of our drinking water. And in fact, at the height of the drought in 2015, San Francisco still had enough water in storage to last 3 years. And you can see that then as we entered 2016, the water bank started to fill, because 2016 was an average year. And in the summer of 2016, when the state was still technically in drought, San Francisco had enough water in storage to last 5 years. So we were in a very enviable position. And then 2017 was the really big water year. And San Francisco needed, I can't see the number right here, I think it's 371,000 acre feet to fill all of their reservoirs, but they were entitled to 3.1 million acre feet. And so almost all of that water had to be spilled into the river or dumped. So from early January into the summer, the flow in the Tuolumne was 9,000 cubic feet per second, which is the maximum that's allowed so that you don't flood Modesto. So what happened was we starved the river for 5 years, and then we had to dump all of that water that we were hoarding in the reservoirs. And what we can show is that at current demand, which is a little less than 200 million gallons per day, San Francisco could manage a repeat of the worst drought on record, which was the 87 to 92 6-year drought, without requiring any rationing and without bringing any new water supplies online. So you end up with 78,000 acre feet, which is not a lot of water. And obviously, they want to be better prepared. So if this case were to happen, we would have rationing probably in the third year. We'd be bringing more water online. So this is not a recommendation that we plan for this, but it's saying, look, San Francisco has a lot of storage, has good water rights in normal and wet years, and we don't need to be so paranoid about running out of water. But San Francisco then responds to this like, well, we're planning for something that we call the design drought, where we take the drought of record, those 6 years, and then we add on the 2 driest years on record, which were 1976 and 1977, to create an 8.5-year drought. And we're planning for demand to be 265 million gallons per day, 25% higher than it is today. So their drought is much more severe that they're planning for than other water agencies. And using their design drought, they tell people that we could have 55% rationing in the third year of a drought. So we had our analysis saying you wouldn't need any rationing. They're saying, well, we're planning for the design drought, which would require excessive rationing. And then organizations like the Bay Area Council, which is a business network, will take that number and they'll lobby politicians and say this cannot happen. So we spent a lot of time in the last year educating the mayor's office, and I think we're making some progress. We also have some new commissioners on the SFPUC who are more open-minded. And I think we're going to make some progress in the coming months. There's going to be a workshop on water supply and demand on March 26th. That should be very interesting. We had a couple of workshops on the science behind the Bay Delta plan and a competing plan that San Francisco wants called a voluntary agreement. So there's much more dialogue now and the information's getting out there, and we have answers to everything. So we feel well positioned after many years of looking into this. So a colleague of mine, actually a volunteer with Tuolumne River Trust, he created a probability analysis of this 8.5-year drought actually happening. And he looked at tree ring data. So we have, data of what the river's flows were for the last 100 years or so. But with tree rings, you can go back 1,100 years. And he sequenced every 8.5-year stretch. And what he found is that it was the drought we had in 87 to 92 was not a common drought, very rare. You can see just a handful of times. And we never had a drought that even got into year 7 of the design drought, let alone 8. And so he can adjust it a little bit if you want to talk about climate change and maybe less precipitation. But the bottom line is, we're looking at a 1 in 40,000 chance of having the design drought. And he did this mostly to say, hey, San Francisco, don't you think it would be wise for you to do your own probability analysis so that you can plan better? But they haven't taken him up on that. A couple of years ago, we did had a professional survey done of San Francisco voters, and we found tremendous support for protection of the Bay and the Tuolumne River. And the Tuolumne was interesting because we first asked people if they knew where their water came from. And 75% could say Hetch Hetchy. So that water supply, that name has been well branded. But only 12% could say that, well, it's the Tuolumne River that fills the Hetch Hetchy reservoir, and therefore that's really our water source is the Tuolumne. But once they learned that, they said, yeah, of course, we have to be good stewards of the river that we depend on, does so much for us. We also found that a major driver for people to conserve water was to benefit the environment. And everyone thought, it's like, oh, I'm making some sacrifices, but it's good for the environment that I care about, and I'm willing to do that. But the truth is, the water we conserved during the drought did not benefit the environment. It was just held behind dams, and the water agencies only released as much water as they were required to. Right now, there are base flows, so you can't go below a certain level. And so they met that requirement, which is awfully low, and they held onto the water. And then again, it all had to be dumped in 2017 when there wasn't enough storage to keep that water. So this graph kind of sums it up, what the problem is. That for 5 years, between 2012 and 2016, only 12% on average of the Tuolumne's unimpaired flow made it down to the San Joaquin, 12%. And then in 2017, all the reservoirs filled up. They had to spill 79% of the water. So you had one really high water year at the expense of 5 terrible years. And that's a big reason why the salmon population is so low. Again, 1,000 fish, where historically there were probably 150,000. So less than, a fraction of 1% of the historic run. And you can see this pattern just repeats over and over again, 2001 to 2005, 2007 to 2011. And so what the Bay Delta Plan attempts to do is even this out a little bit. So you have 40% if it's a dry year, 40% is less water. If it's a big water year, 40% is quite a bit of water, but you'd have at least 40% each year. So, we've been doing a great job with water efficiency. There's still a lot more that can be done. San Francisco is actually, one of the leaders, maybe the leader in the state. And a lot of that's because of the climate, and there aren't a lot of landscapes that need to be watered. So the lower hanging fruit is in the Bosque territory, elsewhere in the Bay Area. And the really low hanging fruit and nuts is in the Central Valley. So we need to keep investing in water conservation and efficiency. We ran a program called the Silicon Valley Water Conservation Awards for 10 years. And there were just wonderful stories about what businesses were doing, or local governments or individuals. And that would inspire others. One time, Oracle won. And in receiving the award, the woman said, well, I'm going to be honest. I came last year and Google won. And I told my staff, we need to win that award next year. And so they invested in all sorts of measures for indoor and outdoor efficiency, and, dropped their water use by probably 25% just from doing that. Again, landscaping is the low hanging fruit. And nowadays, a lot of people are focusing on native landscapes that provide food for pollinators like bees and butterflies, but are just beautiful. I mean, this is maybe a little bit overgrown, but beautiful flowers, and using a lot less water than non-native species that have evolved where it rains maybe throughout the year and more water comes down. Gray water, people are starting to install these systems where you take wastewater from your shower, your washing machine, and instead of putting it into the sewer system, you put it into your yard and irrigate trees and plants, and then you don't need to use precious Hetch Hetchy water to do that. On a larger scale, it's recycled water, where wastewater gets cleaned up from the wastewater treatment plant and is used for irrigation. It's not high enough quality for drinking water, but it's certainly good enough for landscapes. But then you can take it an extra step and do advanced purification, which I call astronaut water, which we've been doing for a long time in space. And basically you use microfilters and reverse osmosis and ultraviolet light to turn wastewater into drinking water. And Orange County right now, they're doing something called indirect potable reuse, where they highly treat the water, and then it filters down into their groundwater basin. And then that groundwater is used for everything: cooking, drinking, irrigation. And they produce over 100 million gallons per day of this advanced purified water. And again, our demand for the whole San Francisco service area is about twice that. So that's indirect potable reuse, and people are more comfortable with it because there's an environmental buffer there. But actually, the water going in is better than the water coming out because it picks up things as it migrates through the soil. But what's being explored right now is direct potable reuse, where you put the water directly into the pipes. And this is a system down in San Jose, where right now they're just blending the advanced purified water with recycled water to bring down the salt content so that all plants, including redwoods that are more salt sensitive, will do better. But then the next step is going to probably be indirect potable reuse to recharge the groundwater basin. But ultimately, it's going to be direct potable reuse. And that's probably going to be in the next 5 years. So they're investing a lot in this technology down there. But again, you know, the real opportunities are in the Central Valley. The farmers pay $20 an acre foot for water. We pay $2,000. We pay 100 times more. So there's a real price signal here. But there are a lot of things that aren't happening in the Central Valley because water is so cheap. Why would you invest in drip irrigation or something else that's going to cost you money and you end up paying more? So San Francisco could say, hey, you know, it's a lot cheaper for us to invest in efficiency for you guys. So we'll do that. And we want to share in the savings. We want you to give us more space in the water bank as a backup. So I think eventually this is what's going to happen, is we're going to help the farmers become more efficient. They, you know, about 10 years ago, they identified a number of infrastructure projects that could save between 25,000 and 40,000 acre feet, which is a lot of water. And amortized over 20 years, it's about $200 per acre foot. Whereas for us to bring on, you know, advanced purified water, it's about $4,000 an acre foot. So it's like, hey, you know, this is a great deal. We can, you know, invest in over there with you guys and share in the savings, and we have more water and you guys depend on less water. So it's a win-win. And then also partnering to recharge the groundwater basin. In big water years like 2017, gosh, if we could take a lot of that water and put it into the groundwater and it's available for agriculture during droughts, that makes a lot of sense. And still the river is going to have plenty of water. So the idea is big gulp, small sips. If you have a big water year, you capture as much of that as possible so that you don't have to take as much in drier years or times of the year. So that wraps up my my presentation. There's a lot of ways people can get involved. Larry shows up to Sfpc meetings. They're online right now, which is really convenient. And you can call in, you can make a comment at the beginning of the meeting and then go about your business. You know, it might take 10, 15 minutes, but then they hear from a new voice and they realize that a lot of people care. So that really helps out. And I invite anyone who would like to be on my email list, I won't spam you too much, to send me an email and just say, hey, you know, let me know about opportunities to learn more or to participate, and I'll keep you in the loop. And we really depend a lot, you know, we're a pretty small organization. We work with a lot of other environmental and fishing groups, but we really depend on volunteers to help us prepare materials or just, you know, speak at a hearing. And it could be as simple as like, you know, gosh, I really care about the Tuolumne River and we need to be good stewards. Or, you know, when I was a kid, we used to go to a family camp there and it's such a special place. And, you know, I'm just horrified that San Francisco is not doing more to be a good steward of the Tuolumne. So with that, I will stop sharing and would welcome any comments people have or any questions. And if people want to talk about water issues outside of the Bay Area, I'd be happy to try to answer any of those questions as well.
Well, Peter, I may as well start off. Thank you so much for all of this information. It's a bit overwhelming in a way, but for some of us, it's kind of a recap and of some parts of it, not all of it. And you presented a really beautiful picture of what's going on from the Tuolumne to our sinks, to our apartments here in San Francisco. So, but anyway, so the Bay Delta plan, I guess, is the one I'm really interested in and keeping up with. So there's so much here to ask about, but where does that stand now? How does it look for the future, the Bay, passing the Bay Delta plan?
Okay, yeah. And first of all, yeah, tons of information in here. It's kind of like whatever you wanted to learn, it should be in there, and probably a lot more than you wanted to learn. But the takeaway is that, Tuolumne is a really special river. It's in bad shape right now. There are things we can do, and opposition to those things is unfounded. So if anyone who walks away with that message, I'll feel that we were successful. I won't ask you about, how many acre feet or million gallons per day. Um, so there were lawsuits, and the State Water Board also left the door open for something called voluntary agreements. And the idea was that different stakeholders would get together, work with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Water Resources, and see if they could come up with something that everyone could live with that wouldn't require as much water. And so they met for probably a year, and they came up with these voluntary agreements. The one on the Tuolumne actually was much better developed than the other ones, and it relied heavily on controlling the non-native predators by putting in a barrier weir, a small dam that somehow would let the native fish go past it, but would keep the bass out. And that's been controversial with Fish and Wildlife agencies saying, we don't think it's going to work. Having fishing derbies, investing some in floodplain restoration, but mostly non-flow measures. And they're only proposing to increase the flows by about 4%. So the environmental groups haven't supported that, but San Francisco keeps pushing it as an opportunity to provide more fish with less water. And so what happened with all of that is Governor Newsom doesn't know a whole lot about California water issues. He doesn't have very good advisors, and he made some really big mistakes. One was the chair of the State Water Board, who oversaw the Bay Delta plan. The next month, her term had expired, and she wanted to be reappointed for another 4-year term. And Newsom buckled to the irrigation districts and didn't reappoint her. So that was strike one. And then there was a law called SB 1. It was also known as the Trump Protection Act, that any rollbacks would be offset, that the state would implement environmental regulations that existed before Trump took office. And again, under pressure, Gavin Newsom vetoed that. And then the Trump administration released something called a biological opinion for the Delta, basically looking at, could we divert more water and what would be the impact on endangered species? And there was a draft report done that was never publicly released that said, if we take more water from the Delta, it's going to have a negative impact. So the Trump administration sidelined those scientists and put in a new group that said, oh yeah, we can take another, 500,000 acre feet from the Delta and it won't have an impact. Well, the LA Times got a hold of the original study and, got out there, but then Newsom was in a position as, do we just let this biological opinion stand and work around it, or do we challenge it? And this time he did step up and he sued the Trump administration to stop that. And then the water agencies, a lot of them walked away from the voluntary agreements. So the voluntary agreements are kind of in limbo right now. And meanwhile, the State Water Board hasn't been moving forward with the Bay Delta plan. So our strategy is we need to peel off San Francisco from the opposition. So we need San Francisco to say, you know what, we can live with the Bay Delta plan. And San Francisco is much more influential than the agricultural irrigation districts. So if we can do that, we think it'll restart the Bay Delta plan. And again, we're making progress. We had these workshops on the science that it was pretty clear that, their science is based on wishful thinking. The National Marine Fisheries Service did a peer review of the science and they found a lot of flaws. So we keep pushing that. And then this water demand and supply issue that I just talked to you all about, that they're really inflating the potential impacts of the Bay Delta Plan. And frankly, we're in better shape than probably any other water agency in California. So that's where things stand.
Thank you very much.
And sorry, my answers aren't briefer. I'm realizing it's like I talk way too much when I'm presenting and I talk way too much when I'm answering a question. I'll try to be a little more brief.
So how about dam removal?
So there's a group called Restore Hetch Hetchy that wants O'Shaughnessy Dam to be removed. And, they, it's a tough sell. I think most people would agree that that wasn't the appropriate place for a reservoir in Yosemite National Park. But what do you do now? And the cost of removing the dam would probably be, $3 to $5 billion. So you have to ask, is that the best use of that money? And I think Restore Hetch Hetchy is correct that, we could make up that supply elsewhere, like maybe raising Don Pedro Dam so that there's more storage there. That water would have to be filtered and it would take energy to pump it to the Bay Area. It wouldn't be gravity fed the same way Hetch Hetchy is. So the last thing I'll mention is that salmon and steelhead probably never made it up that far in the river because there's a waterfall downstream that's pretty tall. So a lot of the reasons for removing dams, like on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, is to allow fish passage. And they've been really successful. You remove a dam and the fish population comes back. So we wouldn't have that benefit from removing O'Shaughnessy Dam. So I think it's a very noble cause. They've gotten quite a bit of traction, but it's probably unlikely that it would happen.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. Can you see them or do you want me to read them out to you?
Let me take a look. Has the rain and snow this year been helpful to the Tuolumne and other rivers and the groundwater? Any rain and snow is helpful, but I think we're about 50% of average precipitation. So, this is one of those years where San Francisco's entitlement isn't very good. I'm not sure if this recent rain and snow helped out, but so far they've only been entitled to 2,000 acre feet. So not a lot of water, but they're also, the snowpack is better than one might expect because it's been a colder winter. And so a lot of the runoff will come, if we have some hot days or, a rain on snow, then the water will come down. So right now we're kind of in the process of switching from, going into these snow banks with a pole and measuring how much water there is that we expect to come down, to something called LIDAR, which is using planes, and you can actually get a much more accurate reading of how much water, and then water managers can say, okay, well, we can plan on that. So that helps us out. But it's been a really dry year. We could use a lot more precipitation. Some years recently, we have seen precipitation in March, April, May. So maybe there's kind of a shift from the rainy season. Instead of starting in November, it seems to start a little bit later now. But certainly water managers are concerned, and every time we have a storm, they get pretty excited and hope for more. The other question is there a way that years of too much water having to be released from behind dams can be released to agriculture and added to groundwater? Actually, a good question. And the irrigation districts will say, if they're criticized for flood irrigating orchards, they'll say it's like, well, that water's not wasted because it's recharging the groundwater and that's available to us. What they're looking at right now is using flood irrigation as a way to capture that extra water and put it in the groundwater. So there's limited amount that you can do there, and probably what we eventually need to do is get that water in the groundwater faster when it's available. So actually, pressurizing it and putting it in. But yeah, they call it the poor man's groundwater recharge is flood irrigation, and just use cropland to recharge. And then another question, do you have any contacts, ideas for how water is being resourced in the Sonoma County area? Sonoma County is interesting. They're doing a lot of things right and some things not so right. I have a friend who's working on water issues there, who I'd be happy to put someone in touch with. So it looks like this is Holly. If you want to email me at peter@tuolumne.org, I can put you in touch with someone who could answer any questions about Sonoma County. And then Tom Higgins writes, isn't it a code violation to divert household water as gray water for the garden? It was, now it's not. I mean, maybe it's in a jurisdiction, but there are a lot of jurisdictions that are allowing it and even providing rebates. But that does bring up the issue of water quality, which is what has slowed down direct potable reuse. But the health code is being updated, and people think that in a couple years, they will allow that. So certainly if we allow water to be treated for drinking water, then it should be okay for irrigation. But one thing about the gray water is you are supposed to have the water enter the soil underground. So you don't just have a hose out there on a tree. You have a system where it's not above the surface, but that is allowed. There's a group called Gray Water Action, gray with an E, spelled with an E, that has a lot of information on gray water. And anyone who's interested in that might check them out. And that's it for the messages in the chat. Anything else? You've given me a lot of your time on a Sunday, and I really appreciate that. And thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit more. And we'd love to have more of you engaged with us. I do see another chat message from Veronica Masterson. I've been driving up to Hetch Hetchy and Camp Mather every year for the past 20 years and passing Don Pedro Reservoir. Way back when it was full. For the past about 10 years, it has been going down. I was so shocked that it was low. Why? So during the drought, it got pretty low. And then in 2017, it was full. And now it's probably about 68% of capacity. And for those large reservoirs, it's typical that in the dry season, you see it drop quite a bit, not as much as during the drought. And San Francisco has all these reservoirs, so we can manage in a way that Crystal Springs always looks full, Hetch Hetchy always looks full. And then the water bank is Don Pedro. So it looks like, well, someone else's water is low. There are some water agencies are dependent on run of river. If you have a lot of water flowing down the river in a certain year, then you're in good shape. But if there's not a lot of water in the river, then you got to do something else. And the irrigation districts are a little bit more that way. They've got a really big reservoir, but they also have a big demand on it. And so they count on it filling each year. And if you have a few years where it's not filling, they have to cut back on surface water they provide, and then they look to pumping groundwater. And then they're still they're probably just about recovered from the recent drought, but I think in the recent drought their groundwater dropped by about 20 feet, and then they start getting a little bit concerned. And then Dolores and Dave ask, have you noticed any harm due to restricting water places to migrating birds in California? I'm sure there have been groups that are monitoring that and have noticed that. I'll tell you that there's kind of an interesting story on the Tuolumne. A farmer realized there was an Aleutian crane, I don't remember the exact name, that was visiting his farmland and foraging on leftover crops. And he did some research and discovered it was a threatened species, maybe even endangered. And so he started managing his farmland that, you know, at the right time, he would just leave it alone and let these cranes come and feast. And so at certain times of the year, you see this pretty rare crane, you know, feasting in this farmland on your way into Modesto. So I don't have a great answer for your question, but certainly when you change an ecosystem, it has an effect on the species that depend on it. And a lot of, you know, the Central Valley used to be a massive wetland, or at least parts of it. And you can imagine birds were everywhere. And then by, you know, creating levees and turning it to farmland, that habitat's gone away. So it makes the Delta even more important than it was historically, as kind of the remnant of that vast wetland. So, well, you know, thank you all again, and would love to give you an update in a year or two and keep you informed. And again, if you just want to keep up with me, send me an email, peter@tuolumne.org, and I'll be sure to keep you in the loop.
Okay, Peter, that brings up one more thing I wanted to say. If there's something we can do as citizens of San Francisco and the Bay Area to help out, to help your efforts and to help the Bay Delta plan and that sort of thing, maybe you could put where your links get us to that. And you're going to put links in the chat for that, or
Yeah,
do something like that, or
our website is let me put it on here. It's tuolumne.org. So as long as you can spell Tuolumne, you're in good shape. And there's also, you know, so I have an email list of kind of more of the campaign stuff, but we have a general email list with a lot of activities and interesting things, so people can get on that. The SFPUC, they've had some challenges recently with corruption, and their general manager departed at the end of November, and they have an acting general manager from within staff who, but they're looking at a long-term permanent general manager, and that process is probably going to take another 5 months. And we've been encouraging the mayor to hire an outsider who really shares the values of San Francisco residents, being environmental protection, and who can reform a broken agency that has been basically misleading and lying to the public and to decision makers for a number of years. And so, you know, weighing in with the mayor, saying, you know, we need a good experienced outsider who can bring this agency in line with the community it supports. That really helps. The workshop on March 26th will be quite educational, and people usually get 2 minutes to speak at those meetings. And again, just saying, you know, hey, here's a new name that is following this, and I want you to represent me better. And then the general SFPUC meetings are the second and fourth Tuesday of the month at 1:30. So they're in the afternoon. And again, there's general public comment at the beginning of the meeting where you can talk about anything under their purview that's not on the agenda. And that's an opportunity to say, me too, you know, I care. So those are the easiest things to do. But then people who want to get into it a little bit more, start doing their own research, and they find a line that really registers with them, and they kind of become an expert, and that makes a huge difference. But it's pretty rare to find people who have that dedication. But certainly, if anyone has any interest, getting on our email list. We don't send out a lot of emails, but good information, and it's up to you then how you want to pursue it.
Okay, great. If that's all the questions, that we certainly thank you, Peter, for this wonderful presentations. And I really appreciated the beautiful pictures that went along with it. So that was really good. So thank you very much. And thanks everyone for attending.
See you around the water
Thank
cooler.
you so much. Thank you.